My subject this evening is beyond actually the theme of this conference. It does not deal with pedagogy, it does not deal with didactics. It deals with a content matter that people are required to deal with as they teach the Holocaust. And it's an interesting fact, I think, that from extreme right-wing Israelis, left-wing Israelis, to our dear friend Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, they all agree on one thing, and that is that the state of Israel is the result of the Holocaust. And that's wrong. It isn't. And I think that it's very important for educators to deal with that topic, because if you accept the common view, you will distort not just historical understanding, what my teachers used to call false historical consciousness, but you will also prevent yourself from dealing with the topic of the Holocaust itself. Let me explain some of the background. Before World War II, in Poland, there were 3.3 million Jews. In elections to Jewish communal bodies in late 1938 and 1939, a plurality of Jewish voters voted for the anti-Zionist and anti-religious Socialist Bund Party, 38%. The Zionist movement was declining, but 1/3 of Jews in Poland voted for the mutually hostile Zionist parties. Less than 1/4, 23%, voted for Orthodox Jewish bodies. You can draw all the wrong conclusions from that, because the explanation for this development was that the Zionists had not managed to open the way to Palestine. And people were desperate. They couldn't stay in Poland and they couldn't leave it. There was an economic situation where about 1/3 of Polish Jewry was on or below the starvation level, where Jewish children couldn't go to school because they didn't have any shoes. And in this kind of a situation, the world was closed, as Chaim Weizmann said in 1939. The world is divided into two: countries from which the Jews cannot go and countries into which they cannot enter. And in this kind of a situation, maybe the solution of the Bund made sense. An ideal of a social democratic Poland without anti-Semitism, where the Jews would be granted autonomous cultural rights in the language spoken by the majority of them, in the Yiddish language. Don't leave Poland, stay here. And the Zionists, split as they were, factionalized as they were declining precisely because of the fact that they couldn't offer any solution. Nor could the Orthodox offer any solution. The transcendence above was not saving anyone, and people were looking for answers. Didn't mean to say, as the apocryphal story goes about a Bundist, that the Bundist on Shabbat morning went to the synagogue. At lunchtime he went around with the blue and white box for the Zionists to collect money to redeem the land in Palestine, and in the afternoon he demonstrated against the rabbis. And that reflects to some extent the reality. And in this kind of a situation, had there not been a war, of course we don't know what would have happened, But there was a tremendous pressure of Polish Jewry, of Lithuanian Jewry, of Romanian Jewry, of the area of Transylvania and the eastern part of Czechoslovakia to leave, to go away, to flee. The Zionists wanted to open the gates of Palestine for the Jews so that they would come here. America was closed. There was rising anti-Semitism in America. During World War II, a plurality, actually by 1944 a majority, of Americans expressed radical anti-Semitic opinions. Western Europe was closed. Latin America was closed. So where should they go? There would have been pressure, I think, on the British mandatory government to allow people to come in. There was in this country, at that time, a change of policy of the British government. In the late 1930s, Palestine became closed, which again is the reason, the main reason why the Zionists failed to get more support than they did. You see, the Holocaust destroyed the communities from which these people could have come here. More Holocaust, less Israel. Had there been no Holocaust, maybe, nobody can tell, there would have been more and better Israel. Maybe sooner, maybe not sooner, but certainly a destruction of these communities prevented the establishment of the State of Israel. And the State of Israel almost did not come into being. It hung by a thread. You know, we all think that because of something happened, it had to happen. The Americans made the Declaration of Independence and founded the community of 13 states because that was inevitable. It had to happen. Nonsense. Had the British government of the day been a little bit more sensible, they would have made the agreement in America that afterwards was made in Canada, and you would have had until today the United States, not the United States, but the United Colonies under the British Crown. Had the British and the French and the Soviets, in their own interest, not because of the blue eyes or the brown eyes of the Jews, but because in their own interest, had they, at that time, in the 1930s, decided to stop the expansion of Nazi Germany, there wouldn't have been a Second World War. Because until 1939, these powers together would have been much stronger than Nazi Germany. Nothing is inevitable in history. And so the general picture is that when the war ended, and there were only remnants of East European Jewry left, and Soviet Jewry was locked in a dictatorship, there was absolutely, realistically speaking, no chance, or very little chance, for the establishment of an independent Jewish Commonwealth in Palestine. That, you see, is the background. So, no Holocaust, more chances. More Holocaust, less chances. Israel was not the result of the Holocaust, it was the result of the fact that the Holocaust did not quite succeed to the end. When the war ended, there were, in my estimation, some 200,000 Jews that emerged from the concentration and slave labor camps of Nazi Germany. About 3/4 of them returned to their countries, Western Europe, Hungary, and other places. Only about 55,000 of them remained in the zones of occupation of the Western powers in Germany and Austria. And then about 300,000 Jews who had escaped from Poland eastward into the Soviet Union as the Nazis advanced began coming back first in driblets, and then in 1946-7 by an agreement with between the Soviet and the Polish governments. And because of the tremendous rise of anti-Semitism in Poland after the war, most of these people moved west. They were organized by an underground movement that started not in this country, that started in Europe. These were the remnants of the Jewish fighters, partisans, and so on. Some people who hid, and people who began coming back from the Soviet Union. And they organized the largest illegal underground migration that Europe had seen in the 20th century, moving some 300,000 people from Eastern Europe to Central and Southern Europe between 1945 and 1948. And from there was then a movement to Palestine, organized partly by the same people and partly by people who came from here. Now you see, in these Central European countries, in Germany and Austria and Italy basically, there was a concentration of Jews in so-called displaced persons camps. In these camps, most of the Jews, the 55,000 original ones, and the 250,000 or so that came later, and 50,000 was spread all over the place, maintained a Jewish life. They were thrown together. Perhaps under other circumstances they wouldn't have had that common Jewish experience. But again, you see, America was closed. They couldn't go there. In 1948, there was a first sort of break in this. And then in 1950, actually the American Congress decided on an immigration law that limited Jewish immigration to America from the DP camps. If you read what they actually passed, you will see that they would accept people with agricultural and mining experience. The little Jewish peddler didn't fit into that. Had it not been for some Irish people, Irish Americans in the visa department, in various other departments of the American government, who, contrary to the legislation, permitted Jews to come in, the Jews in 1948, 49, 50 wouldn't have come to America either. Did you know that? And so these people are concentrated in these camps. They organize themselves. Where do they want to? Where can they go? There's nowhere they can go. And so the Zionists took over because they said, we want to go to Palestine. From the Zionist point of view, worst circumstances. If America suddenly had opened its gates, 1/3 of these roughly 300,000 people would have come to Palestine anyway, would have pressed to come to Palestine anyway. In my estimation, and there's a big argument about it, and I have one opinion and other people have other opinions, 2/3 would have gone to America. As it was the other way around. 2/3 came here and 1/3 went to America. Or in other places. You see, the remnants, and they created a tremendous pressure, first of all on the Americans, but also on the British. Who would feed them? Who would look after them? The American army was not unwilling to treat them fairly, but they needed money. And the American Senate refused funds for Jews. So the only way was to get them out of the American zones of occupation. Where? Well, certainly not to America. And so there was pressure by the American government on the British to permit at least some of them to come to Palestine. And there was a committee that decided in 1946 to permit 100,000 Jews from these DP camps to come here. Had the British agreed to that, there would have been no Israel. because the steam would have gone out of this pressure cooker. The 100,000 would have come. There would have been, instead of close to 600,000 Jews in Palestine, there would have been 700,000 Jews, and there would have been an Arab majority, and everything would have been fine. There would have been an Arab state of Palestine with a Jewish minority. But the British refused. Why? Because they were afraid that these 100,000 would create a tremendous pressure from the Arab world on the declining British Empire, and they needed Arab support. It wasn't just oil, it was strategy. It was a contact to the Far East. Although the Labour government of the day wanted to get rid of India and what is now Sri Lanka, Ceylon. But that would take time, and in the meantime, there had to be some strategic guarantee for the British Empire to continue to exist in these areas. And so Palestine is needed at the beginning. And in this kind of a situation, you see, there was this pressure which came from parts of the American establishment, from President Truman personally. President Truman did not want a Jewish state in Palestine, contrary to everything that you've read. Truman wanted to, out of partly humanitarian considerations, but largely because the Jews had votes in New York and Pennsylvania and Florida and California. And he was in a very bad situation in America in 1946, 47, and 48. And so he needed the Jews. Didn't particularly like them, but okay. And so he wanted these Jews to come to Palestine, not to America, God forbid. And so he pressed the British government to permit it. And the British said no, and that saved us. That saved us. And then you see, you had this continued pressure. They couldn't remain, these people in the DP camps in Europe. They couldn't remain there. And at the same time, there was the Jewish population of Palestine, called the Shuv, at that time, where underground movements developed, where military action was taken against the British. The British could have dealt with that easily enough. They had experience in this. But they couldn't very well put up machine guns on Mughrabi Square in Tel Aviv, because it was a Labour government, and that wouldn't go down very well with the British voters. In any case, killing Jews after World War II in Palestine was not a very good idea. The British government hesitated. They wanted to find a compromise that would maintain British rule in the Middle East. And that meant an Arab state with a guaranteed Jewish minority. Well, the Arabs wouldn't guarantee a Jewish minority, and the Jewish minority didn't want to live in an Arab state. And so there was no possibility of a compromise. And in the end, the British handed over the whole thing to the United Nations, in the hope that the United Nations would agree on a compromise solution which would return Palestine to an Anglo-American mandate. And then the British and Americans would decide what to do. There was a lot of logic in that. I mean, who would vote for a Jewish state? The Soviets? The Soviets were anti-Zionist. The Latin Americans? They were influenced by the Vatican. The Vatican would never agree to Jerusalem becoming a Jewish city. Western Europe? Well, Western Europe was in British hands, basically. The French, the Belgians, the Dutch, and all the others would vote for Britain. With who would the Zionists be left in a decision brought to the United Nations? There was a lot of logic in that, you see. And again, the reason why it didn't work out could not have been foreseen except by somebody really, deep analysis, which politicians very rarely do. The Latin Americans were satisfied with the fact that a partition decision by the United Nations would leave Jerusalem under a separate rule. international rule. That was all right. It would be neither Muslim nor Jewish. That was fine. Western Europeans hated the British. Anything the French could do after the war to put obstacles in the way of Great Britain, they would do. And then the Soviet Union. Now, there was only one speech at the United Nations that mentioned the Holocaust. And that was the speech of Andrei Gromyko, the representative of the Soviet Union, on the 14th of May, 1947. Exactly a year before the declaration of the State of Israel. And Gromyko said that Jews have suffered and so on and so forth, and during the war, that the term Holocaust or anything like that was, of course, unknown then. And therefore, the Soviet Union thought that if there was no other way and no compromise could be reached between Jews and Arabs, then the place should be partitioned. I will not reveal any great secret to you if I tell you that Comrade Gromyko was not particularly concerned about the fate of Jews. But what he was concerned about was to get the British out of Palestine. And the Jews would be an excellent tool to do that, because the Jews were anti-British. They wanted to get the British out. And they would create some kind of a state here. And then, because the Arab countries were under feudal rule, then everything would be okay. That was the only mention of the Holocaust in that whole process, from 1945 to 1948. Anyone who thinks that the Jews got the state because of some guilt feelings of some states is barking up the wrong tree. We have today access to all the documents of 1947-48, including the United Nations, of course. There was no one who even mentioned it. People considered whether they were pro-Vatican or not, whether the situation in Palestine was good for them or bad for them. The suffering of the Jews in Europe, that was in the background somewhere. Nobody really cared about it. Truman never mentioned it. The idea that somebody thought that the Jews should get a state because of their suffering during the Holocaust is a post-Israel invention. It never happened. It was never there. It was much more complicated, as I tried to show you. And if I had more time, I would make it even more complicated. It's not very difficult. It's not very complicated to make it more complicated. But you see, I think that one has to realize what this wrong notion actually means. It means that the Jews did not really have, as Nathan Sharansky said here, an identity worth anything, because all their identity really was suffering and murder and so on. That's all there is. The fact that the Jews, for good or for bad, for good I think, but some people may disagree, created over a long period of time a basis in this country for the establishment of autonomous, independent Jewish community, that is completely forgotten. The idea of a Jewish state was not born in 1945. It was born at the end of the last century. Oh, last century, previous century, 19th century. I belong to I think it should be obvious to people that this idea of a Jewish state was with the people, or Jewish autonomous existence of some kind, was with the Jewish people, with a large number of Jewish, not with all of them, of course, for a very long period of time. Even when there was a decision at the United Nations to partition Palestine, to establish two states, a Jewish and an Arab one, even then the thing was not assured. By February-March 1948, the Jews in Palestine were on the run, basically. We were cut off one part of the place to the other. Jerusalem, Jewish Jerusalem, was isolated. The struggle of the Palestinian national movement, led at that time by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amir al-Husseini from Cairo, wanted to eliminate this population. And they said so very clearly. It hung in a balance. And then we got arms. Because of the Holocaust, forget it. We got arms from the Czechoslovak Republic, which had been taken over by the communists in February 1948. And there is a crucial meeting of the Central Committee of the Czechoslovak Communist Party in late February 1948, in which the question is raised, should we supply arms to the Jews in Palestine? And somebody asked the obvious question, what do our Soviet comrades think about it? In other words, is there a diktat by the Soviet government one way or the other? And the person responsible for the contacts with our dear Soviet comrades says, the Soviet ambassador to Prague says, whatever you like to do, do. We don't want to intervene, provided you don't send arms to Franco's Spain. I'm quoting. Yeah? And provided you get dollars, very important, for those arms, sell it to whoever you want. And then there's an argument within the Central Committee of people who want to be friendly with Jews because there is a different background in Czechoslovakia than there was in Poland and other places. And they decide to send arms. It was their decision, not a Soviet decision. Without those arms, we would have never made it. And with those arms, we made it with tremendous difficulty. They stood 25 kilometers south of Tel Aviv. And, you know, America, I don't believe in miracles, but I'll quote to you the famous saying, and that's documented, by Chief Rabbi Herzog in 1943, when he was asked, how could the British, being defeated everywhere where they tried, how could they possibly win the war against Nazi Germany? And he said there are two ways. The natural way or the miraculous way. The natural way would be for God to intervene and make a victory for the British. The supernatural way would be that the British would win its battle against the Germans. And we won it by supernatural means. We won the battles. We paid for it very heavily. 1% of the Jewish population of Palestine perished there. But you know, one has to look at it from the perspective of teaching what you teach. The people who survived the Holocaust arrived only after May 1948 in this country. Not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. Until 1948, when the thing hung in balance, it was the local Jewish youth here, many of them, of course, coming from Europe in the 1930s, who fought and fell and, in the end, won out. There was no hatred towards the neighbors, to the Arabs. Well, there was on the margins, yes. There was a decision, a conviction that we must have our independence because otherwise, and here we knew, otherwise we will share the fate of those in Europe just a few years ago. And it was that determination, and there you do have the connection between the Holocaust and the State of Israel. So the Holocaust didn't produce the State of Israel. But paradoxically, you see, the Holocaust produced a society that could remember the Holocaust. Without Israel, it would probably have looked quite differently. And I think this is where we are. We have to teach. You see, my deceased friend, very close friend, and opponent as a historian, Raoul Hilberg, who unfortunately died a year and a half ago, used to tell me, Yehuda, he said, we are in the truth business. We have to say the truth, whether it's easy or difficult, whether we like it or not. And here it's neither nor. It's not a question of good or bad. It's a question of fact. You know, I don't support these people who say that you can't really deal with facts because everybody sees facts differently. There's the modernist kind of approach. I'm of the old school. I think facts are facts. And the facts are that the Holocaust did not create the State of Israel. It almost prevented it from coming into existence. Thank you.